For more insight, Simon Tay, chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, joins us here in studio. Good morning, Professor. Thanks for coming in.
Morning, Steve.
The UN rights chief has described Myanmar's situation as catastrophic, and we have only seen things regress over the past 2 years. Yet the world seems as if it's forgotten about Myanmar. Why don't we care more?
Well, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right to describe the situation in the country. It's not stable and probably getting worse. I think partly the world has so much attention drawn to Ukraine. You look at the UN General Assembly and the overall attitude. There's been so much attention and resolutions on Ukraine, and there was a huge pause after the early UNGA resolution, a huge pause until this more recent UN Security Council resolution. So I think international community has had its eye off the ball. Who has been holding the problem, for better or worse, is ASEAN. ASEAN may not have the solution, but it's been really encumbered by this big problem.
Perhaps also sort of the lack of movement of progress has also sort of allowed it to sort of fall off the radar, if you like. But with coming back to ASEAN's role and the five-point plan that they tried to in place, it's largely been ignored, despite the fact that Myanmar generals have been left out of ASEAN meetings and things like that. But we've just seen today more sanctions come in from the international community. Do you think that is a possible, more productive way of making progress on Myanmar?
I think there needs to be a mixture of sanctions and then some allowance of dialogue. I mean, first of all, the five-point consensus in some elements still makes sense. You can't possibly resolve a deep problem in the country without a dialogue between all the stakeholders, and this is critical. Whatever happens, this doesn't require a change of plan, it more requires a push. So then the sanctions get us there. I think not on their own. The country and the generals in particular are very used to being isolated. They went through this decades ago. They have various soft border entrance points. They have things they can sell easily, like rubies and resources. They'll never starve, the generals, I mean. And they have shown an attitude of starving the people and not suffering themselves. So then I think it's time to start looking at it anew. But remember still, ASEAN probably can't solve this. A lot of the key players, China, Russia, India, outside ASEAN, Japan too, has had a lot of influence.
You mentioned that the generals can survive this, but the people are the ones that are suffering. If sanctions do come in from the international community, will it not be then the people of Myanmar that will then also suffer more?
Yeah. Well, I think the specific sanctions tend to be targeted. They really are naming people, the generals and people around them, and I think products that have military use, companies that are owned by the military companies, state-owned enterprises. The new attack on the sanction, not attack, on the petroleum sector, oil sector. I think this is important because a lot of that money goes directly to the government or the military, which controls it now. I think that we need to make sure that there's still enough humanitarian aid and, of course, normal business. There are business people who, after the decade of opening, are trying to run clean businesses. They don't really have, they're not cronies. They're trying to make a decent living. And the trouble is when we pull back too hard. Also, this last year, we've seen an effort to declare money laundering problems. And that may undercut the ability of these honest companies to get bank financing from Singapore or Hong Kong or other centers. And that is quite negative.
It's a fine balance. Just last week, the military government announced new rules, new electoral rules pertaining to a so-called election in September. UN Special Envoy Noeleen Heyzer has described or told our correspondent that these polls are going to be a trigger point for violence. Some have called these new rules farcical. What do you make of these new rules and their role in the upcoming election?
Dr. Heyzer is a friend, and I respect her view greatly. I haven't been to the country as she did recently. So the reading of how it will affect the domestic, I'm not sure I'm the right person to question her view. I do think that there will certainly be contestation. Whether it be violent, that's a different question. Right now, when you look at, compared to where we were a year ago, the amount of street conflict has been reduced. Instead, we're seeing targeted attacks at bus shelters, attacks on certain officials or civil servants. And I think these things will continue in a kind of, nobody's accepting this coup in Myanmar. When you push it out into election, I think the danger is more external. Will people be tempted to recognize the general election if it elects only generals? I think that is the point where ASEAN will need to figure out whether they can hold a line on that or in its whole idea of non-interference, well, as flawed it is, accept it anyway. I think the Thai election was fairly flawed, and we accepted General Prayut and he became Prime Minister Prayut. The generals in Myanmar must be thinking the same thing. So I think that the UN international bodies would do very well to set up certain parameters. I think that the outlawing of so-called terrorist organizations, which includes the NLD when most of the NLD is detained, is farcical. And if people start to leave the NLD and forming their own little pop-up parties and are too close to the generals, that really won't help.
So just coming back to ASEAN and what you said just then, I mean, back in 1997 when Myanmar joined ASEAN, it was under military rule.
Yes.
It's now under military rule again. So are you saying that there is the possibility that ASEAN could accept an outcome of an election that could happen?
Well, if you look at the ASEAN Charter, you have both the old principles, non-interference, the one that came in 1997. Then you have new principles that embody the newer ethos, democracy, good governance, human rights. And if you look at the political positions of Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore, and as opposed to Thailand and Cambodia, Vietnam, there are differences. I think it came to the fore when Thailand late last year tried to hold a meeting about Myanmar, and only they and the Indo-Chinese countries came, whereas Indonesia and Malaysia have stayed clear. So the other thing externally is the schism in Myanmar dangerously could cause a schism among ASEAN, holding this problem and trying to figure out what to do with it. We hope that Indonesia will exercise strong but wise leadership, not to push too hard, but nevertheless keep an eye on the problem.
Do you think it's fair to put so much responsibility to solve this crisis on ASEAN? You alluded earlier that ASEAN doesn't really have the solution.
Well, I think somebody's got to rally the orchestra. I think that ASEAN, especially the chair, will have informal dialogues going on with the key players. So, and this gives ASEAN a necessary voice. It's important for ASEAN to be in the game. Otherwise, logically, it'll be outside. And the question is then, will this situation continue? One of the dangers I'm thinking about is if the military are determined to fight, they're getting more arms from Russia and etc. At the moment, support for the NUG is non-lethal. But if it escalates, could we see continued fairly large-scale fighting? And then could ASEAN be labeled sort of the home of the next Libya? I think that's really a kind of nightmare scenario. I don't want to say that's going to happen, but it's the kind of situation you want to work to avoiding. We're not sure it can solve the problem, but we can sort of stabilize it and prevent it from getting worse. We're not doing too badly.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. So much to unpack. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for your insights today. That was Simon Tay from the Singapore Institute of International Affairs.